Network automation takes a variety of forms, from individual scripts that handle specific tasks to workflows that have to be orchestrated across multiple devices and systems. Today on the Tech Bytes podcast, we talk with sponsor Pliant about its automation platform. Pliant helps you orchestrate across devices and domains with a low-code approach that uses APIs to automate and orchestrate across your infrastructure. Our guests to introduce us to Pliant and what it can do for your network automation initiatives are Philippe Vincent, CEO, and Dave Hegenbarth, VP of Sales Engineering. Philippe and Dave, welcome to the podcast. And Philippe, can you start us off with the elevator pitch on Pliant and what you do?
The first challenge that Pliant helps you address, I think the main challenge to automating network operations is really about solving the problem of bringing coding knowledge and competency into the network engineering discipline. We just saw that at Network Automation Forum. That's really one of the key challenges. Now, Pliant itself is essentially an integrated development environment for engineers. It's there to make it simpler and faster and more productive for engineers to build automation code and integration code. And the way we do that are some of the things you just mentioned. We're low code. So users drag and drop and they connect function blocks in our product, which means they can focus on the business logic or the logic of their workflows as opposed to the syntax. We're also API first, which means our preferred method for connecting and controlling network environment is through APIs. And every API that our customers may need is fully represented in our product. So they drag and drop that into their workflow environment.
So that sounds like a really modern approach. What we're seeing then is that Pliant is taking the API first, low code, that most of the software that you use is the same across all networks. But it's the business usage of the technology that varies between customers. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, we want to bring our customers' environment at their fingertip in our development environment so that they can build the code they need, and their world is entirely supported in our product.
I mean, it's all well and good to be, finger banging the keyboard to get your Python scripts just right, but sometimes you've just got to get the job done, and using a set of tools to do that for you is way more efficient. Dave, did I get that right as well?
You did. We designed the product really to allow people to accelerate that automation journey without having to have deep development skills. And that's all why it's wrapped around low code, no code.
Yeah, a lot of network engineers are uncomfortable about coding. So can you say more about what low code actually means? How much coding is actually involved in using Pliant?
Yeah, so you have to have a certain understanding of basic programming skills, like what variables do, what loops and if statements and evaluations are. But we take away having to understand the complex syntax of Python or Node.js. And even we make it simpler than the YAML you would find in Ansible playbooks. You simply are dragging and dropping a series of steps to make the automation possible.
I think there's also, this idea that APIs work, but each vendor has their own APIs, but all the APIs do the same thing. So having someone manage the APIs for you and reduce them to the same thing gets a repeatability about consuming the APIs?
It does. It also relieves them of the task of making sure they have the most current API, and the platform is self-documenting. So we bring the API documentation along with it. If you're writing scripts, you'd have to go find that somewhere on the internet.
Yeah, and I think that API management aspect is key, because if you are using APIs to do your automation, trying to keep up with any changes or new APIs across a variety of devices could be a real pain.
It is. And I want to make sure that our listeners understand it's not just APIs. We do support legacy SSH and Telnet, because there are those legacy devices that don't have APIs, and we don't want to leave those out.
I just call SSH an API. It's a CLI API.
There we go.
I mean, we can't say it's not an API, because it is, but it's not an efficient API. It's not a performant API, and it's not a reliable API compared to, the other types of, the REST or, whatever, SOAP or YAML or so forth that we're using. So it's what we use. Sometimes it's the only way we've got to use. So we need to be able to support that.
Absolutely right. I mean, one of our best use cases is device lifecycle management, and that breaks down into day zero or day one. Day zero, we support, not only SSH, but NetMiko, things like Napalm, and we also support things like Jinja templates, right? So there's always going to be day zero differences. Management IP is different. VLAN might be different, but the golden config, that config you want to distribute repeatedly to every site, is going to be the same, and we support that. And we make it easy to build out those sorts of workflows to do that.
Okay, so let's then dive into a use case. And I guess since you brought up device management, device provisioning, can you talk about, how I would use Pliant to do things like my day zero provisioning and then going into day one and day two?
Absolutely. Without a visual, it's a little tough, but we have these drag and drop blocks we build to help you do that, right? So all the steps that you're going to do around validating the device has the right IP address, right? Whether it has the right version of code, all the things you might want pre-deployment, we're able to pull those into a series of visually attractive blocks that allow you to do those steps.
So you've actually got it sounds like you said this attractive block. So this actually sounds a bit like an IDE, an integrated development environment where I'm actually going in and a lot of the capability, like the documentation, the visual interface and all that sort of stuff is actually prepared or optimized for me.
Absolutely. A lot of times when I present this to developers who have been coding all their lives, they have their favorite IDE. It changes some of that text, different colors to represent things. And you can see the very likeness over in Pliant, but it's represented as a full UI where you can see the loops and the trees that you would use rather than just changing colors to indicate certain things.
And this provisioning, I assume, I can bring a device on board, but then can I get it to get an IP and install configuration, that kind of thing? How deep can I get here?
Well, I think if we go back to the IDE for a minute, Pliant is a development platform. So whatever steps you have in your process today, we can replicate those programmatically. So the answer is yes to what you just said, but we're going to do that through a series of drag and drop blocks. And then we can continue on with day one and day two, right? We can always go back and evaluate the status of that device through any of those methods to figure out if it's compliant. A lot of times when we talk about day one, day two, we interact with other technologies, which is another great thing about Pliant. We support just a broad width or breadth of vendors. So maybe we go to something like ServiceNow and we check what the actual versioning of the things should be. And then we check the field switches themselves and try to fix that automatically.
And can I use this for, managing config drift or updating network OSs, for example?
Absolutely. Yep. So we want to store those golden configs somewhere. Could be in GitHub, you can even use ServiceNow for this. We've seen customers do that. And then we want to weekly, monthly, whatever, review our groups of switches and routers and things like that to make sure they're running the correct configs, that the config is not drifted, things like that. Absolutely.
That's a security feature as well as a dark overlord of the network.
Yes.
Because, Yeah. But I mean, that's increasingly that config drift and configuration is now a security. And increasingly, it's also becoming an insurance issue because insurance companies are saying, I need you to know what's actually going on. And if the network changed, it becomes an auditing thing. So are you adding auditing functionality and capabilities in there?
We really are. Let's go back to the IDE, right? We're a very easy to use development platform. So if that's the direction you want to take Pliant, you are welcome to do that. We have some samples, but you're the ultimate driver of how that automation or orchestration is going to look like.
Right. And so the same thing would apply to asset management and configuration management. That's all a natural function of your platform. It's just a question of getting some automations together or some orchestrations together that would do that for me. It's my choice.
Absolutely. And it'll bring us back to, the breadth and width of the Pliant platform. Another thing that our customers use us for is trying to determine a source of truth. I always joke, one of our largest customers, I asked them, how many sources of truth do you have for the network? And they said 9. And I said, how do you have 9 sources of truth? And arguably proponents of the network would say the network itself is the source of truth and the database is simply the representation of that source of truth. But because we support so many different technologies, so many different databases, so many asset management systems through our API integrations, we're able to really pull together a list for them. And then we go to something like InfoBlocks and we see, hey, InfoBlocks, did you really hand out an IP address to this particular device? Because it's probably one of the closest sources of truth, right?
Right. So let's go through a second use case if we could. I'm thinking something like, VM creation, which is a fairly standard task in an organization. That does require some work on the back end for network engineers. You've got to add it to the network. It needs an IP address. It needs observability. Maybe there's firewall rule changes that need to happen. How does Pliant help me with that task?
Absolutely. I mean, part of the intellectual property of Pliant is our ability to pull in any API. So we support all the different firewall platforms. And if we don't support that platform, you're allowed to submit a ticket to us as part of your subscription, and we will get that API in there. So you have those drag and drop blocks to actually provision that. We started a number of years ago, and we'd ask a team, how long does it take to actually create a virtual machine? And they would say, 8 or 9 days. And everyone at the table would object to that, right? Like it only takes a minute to get an IP. It only takes 5 minutes to spin it up. But the handoff of that ticket prior to doing automation was, there were gaps all the time. And we have the ability to interact with either cloud or something on-prem like VMware OpenStack. We have the ability to go get it, put it in the right network, give it the right IP, generate the right DNS name, and get that lodged into InfoBlocks or some tool like that, put it in a CMDB because it's now a corporate asset. And then we can put it in whatever you use for observability, right? Your monitoring platform as well.
Right.
I think that's, calling out the basic difference between automation, which could be sort of, single use scripts, and orchestration, which is I have to do a series of tasks across a variety of platforms or domains, and they have to happen in the right order at the right time.
And we go back to that visual representation, right? It all looks the same. So it's no longer I have to have one guy coding to this technology and someone else coding to that and try to stitch those together. They can all live in that workflow.
Yeah, I was thinking about these days when you put a rule into an application firewall, you also have to go and tell the seam. And then you might have to go to some third-party service and tell the third party, nowadays we export a lot of records off. I'm thinking about companies who have external SOCs and things like that. There's just so much configuration work that happens these days that would really improve from orchestration, just being done automatically. Add a rule, all these other things happen. Access lists get updated, firewall config, seam devices, and so on.
And then you add in something like chat ops, right? Making sure that gets echoed back so the whole team knows that this is going on. I mean, there are two fears we've seen in the automation world. One is blast radius, right? How many devices will my automation affect? The other is just the lack of visibility of automation, right? Like, how do I know it worked? How do you know, Dave, that that's going to work every day? Once you've done it for a little while, it becomes almost second nature. When it fails, you're just absolutely shocked. But to get started, a lot of times people need to understand that this is going to work for them.
I want to challenge you on something. As part of the prep, I was studying up on the product, and you're saying here on your website, maximum turnaround for a new API is just 15 days. That's a big claim. How are you doing that so quickly?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's part of our intellectual property, and we've designed a series of parsers and scrapers and things that allow us to take different API documentation sources. I mean, OpenAPI is super, super simple, but we have SOAP parsers and HTML documentation parsers. We have the ability to parse and bring in the API endpoints themselves in those blocks, and also the documentation that the vendor will supply right along with it, so that when you want to build that workflow, everything you need to do is right there.
And are you able to expose these workflows or playbooks? I don't know how do you refer to them. Sort of like a catalog for a network engineer to come in and say, I need to do X, Y, and Z task. Oh, here's the workflows I need to run.
We are. We very much like Ansible has Galaxy. We have a library, a site called hub.pliant.io that you can go and see those sample ones. As I build workflows, they can become part of the Pliant library that others can use very easily.
Okay, so if I built a workflow, I think it's good I can share it with other Pliant users.
Absolutely, you can. Not only that, we have two other features in the application. One is a full-on API gateway. So right after you drag and drop those blocks, without writing a single line of code, you can publish your automation as an API endpoint itself through the API gateway. And again, without writing any lines of code. We also have a small UI in there. So if you want to publish it as a tile that someone pushes, I need to update something, I want to just push a tile, I'm not programmatic, you can do that as well.
So my thinking about this is that I would use this on-prem, but can I also use it since you're API driven in the public cloud to, run automations in the public cloud?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So, we're talking about VM creation, and we don't really care whether that's on-prem VMware OpenStack or if that's Azure, AWS, GCP, because we are API driven, really where that workload lives, we have the blocks, the API endpoints, and the automation to build whatever you want.
Okay. And speaking of cloud, is this delivered as SaaS? Is this something that I run on-prem? How is it deployed to me?
We can deploy either. So we can deploy on-prem, we can deploy in the cloud, or a hybrid model where we have what we call remote workers that get delivered on-prem. They connect back via SSL to the cloud is in the hybrid model. So you can set it up however you need to for the environment you're working in.
Okay, so one last thing before we wrap. Folks are sort of concerned about automation running wild. So is there any kind of control over the system regarding which engineers get to use specific automations?
Absolutely. So we are a full-on platform for development, and we have very granular role-based access control. That can drive all the way down to an API endpoint itself. So a lot of times when you're dealing with endpoints or APIs, API security will allow you either all or nothing. Inside the Pliant platform, you can limit engineers to just list this or create this, but not delete something. It brings up one more thought of mine just as we close out. You can actually bring your own scripts and control those via the role-based access. So what I mean by that is you can bring your Ansible playbooks. You can bring your Python scripts. You can bring your PowerShell. Those will fit right into a block. So you don't have to rewrite the current automation you have to fit inside a low-code platform.
Smoother onboarding means you can come from where you are and get to where you're going quite quicker without having to throw everything away or stuff.
Absolutely. I'd never argue that drag and drop is faster than the stuff you've already written.
But it's faster than the next stuff you're going to write. That's the key.
Exactly.
Dave, if folks want to get more information then about Pliant, where should they go?
Yeah, you can come find us at pliant.io/packetpushers, or we're on the web. We also have a YouTube channel as well.
Okay, that's pliant.io/packetpushers. We'll also have other links in the show notes that accompany this podcast. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Philippe, for joining us. And thanks to Pliant for being a sponsor. As always, thank you for being a listener. If you like this episode, there are many more fine, free technical podcasts and our community blog and our free Slack channel. It's all at packetpushers.net. You can hear us on Spotify. And if you would, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. And last but not least, remember that too much networking would never be enough.